Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review Last Action Hero. So, ultimately, this is a Arnold Schwarzenegger film, but also when looking at it, it's a movie within inside a movie, and I thought that was the most interesting thing about it. Recently, we have it to where maybe if probably were someone to have heard this pitch about this movie, they probably would not have understood it. It'd be like, what? So I'm being like, who am I being in this movie? It's like, well, you're being Arnold Schwarzenegger, but then you're also, for most of this movie, being a character called Jack Slater. And so, reasonably, we have it to where there is a kid who is ultimately called Danny that seems to be a film fanatic that ultimately has seemingly tied himself onto a action star of sorts and reasonably is just so enthralled with his action star to ultimately he is kind of seeing Arnold's character being played out by seemingly anybody, even when it's not an actual Jack Slater movie. Um, but anyways, we have a tour within this film that we have Danny that is going to ultimately get a special ticket, a golden ticket, to get way further into a movie than he would ultimately want to get into. Because when looking at it, you have it to where we have Danny where he can be able to figure out what is all going on in this story, and we have it to where Danny is consistently trying to force Jack Slater's character to realize that he is himself a movie character to the point of really going and trying in several layers or levels to be able to figure out that that ultimately Jack Slater is or to ultimately make Jack Slater figure out that he is a fiction, a work of someone else, and that ultimately we have it to where Jack is realizing that that is dawning on him, and he is ultimately cursed by it. So we go into this movie, and I enjoy the fact that reasonably there is also another movie that is quasi like this. We have it to where we have the movie that is like it's kind of the same thing, but it kind of is going with a different genre. There's a movie called The Final Girls. Ultimately, when I always would be like, yeah, I really just enjoy The Final Girls, even though it's a goofy film. Um, but ultimately, that movie is similar to this one, and so that's why, like, it's almost kind of like shot for shot, kind of quasi similar in a lot of aspects. So, going into this movie, I think I'm going to sneeze here in a second. I'm probably going to pause here because I got to sneeze. There we go. So we go into here and we have it to where Danny seemingly knows the ins and outs of Jack Slater. And so now we just have it to where Danny is kind of telling everybody about their whole backstory and everything like that. And they're like, dude, I've never met you before. And Danny's like, yeah, I know. But if anything, just kind of let me like talk to you for a while. So yeah, going in here, we kind of have to have a lot of tropes that kind of go into an action movie, or just kind of like a that old fashioned like cop approach, where repetitiously several times over and over and over again, we have it to where Jack Slater is ending up throwing in his badge or end up getting fired or whatever to ultimately just get rehired all over again just because. So all well with that, we finally have to finally show a movie store in a movie, which rarely ever happens, with the exclusion of maybe Captain Marvel. So going into this, I thought that this movie was really fun. It's really enjoyable, and like the funny nature of which that this goes into really helps us cement that Arnold could be more than just a action star. He can eventually also be a comedian as well. and kind of throw in some jokes more so than anything else. So I think that's all that I really have to say about this movie in a very spoiler like or very cryptic like way. But let's get into spoilers about this movie. Reasonably, I'm gonna try to probably as quickly as possible just kind of bang this one out. Just bang it a bang. Just do that thing that ultimately we know full well that is ultimately coming. So getting out that double five to otherwise spoiler time into this. Yeah, I like that they kind of at some points in this movie they kind of throw the kitchen sink at everything, and ultimately they have like bizarre things going on, like an animated cat or something like that. Ultimately, where can exactly you see this movie? Well, ultimately, when going into Hulu, it would tell me, I think, like Stars or something like that, that ultimately you would need a subscription for Stars. By and large, I would just say go out of your way to just go into any movie app or whatever, and like a movie pro or maybe a movie playbox or a TV Crush or something like that, and probably watch this movie. Because ultimately, I thought it was a great film that I thought was really interesting. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about the time I'm going to spoil this movie. So we have it to where in the very beginning of this film, we ultimately have a scene where it seems like Derek, who is John Slater or Jack Slater's boss, is ultimately kind of having a uh, like a standoff with some killer that's on top of some rooftop. Ultimately, we have all the cops out in front of the building, and Derek is calling all the shots. And we ultimately have Jack Slater, who ends up walking in there and just is taking charge of everything. Derek is ultimately telling Jack Slater is like, "Hey, no, don't go any further. We already have an interrogator coming," and Jack Slater's kind of like interrogate this kind of thing and like going off, and we have it to where Derek is ultimately just trying to follow behind him and ultimately tell him like, if you go any further, it's gonna cost you your badge. And we have it to where Tina Turner just kind of walks in, and she is mentioning that there is some deputy political figure that ultimately Jack Slater is just gonna like want to get him shoved out of the way and punched in the face. Like, tell me where the official political figure is, and so Jack Slater walks on. So we have it where Derek is mentioning that this will cost Jack his badge if ultimately he goes for any further into talking to Ripper, and we have it where Jack just flings his badge over his shoulder to give to Derek and walks onto here to ultimately get his son that is on the rooftop with Ripper. So, because he rips juicy farts. So I had to put that joke in there. So we ultimately have it to where Jack is to be on this rooftop, and we have it to where Jack ultimately puts his gun off to the side, and we have it to where eventually Jack rolls a grenade close to Ripper and ultimately doesn't go off, and Ripper's like, what am I supposed to do with this? To where ultimately the kid ends up grabbing the grenade and squeezing it to where it comes to be a knife, and the kid stabs Ripper, and we have it to where Ripper ends up tossing the kid off to the side, and we have it to where Jack ultimately is going in pursuit of Ripper, and the scene just kind of just starts to just kind of blur up or fudge up or whatever, and we have it to where uh, Danny is ultimately yelling, "Hey, there's something wrong with the screen. What's going on? It's blurry." So we have to where Danny goes to the concession stand person, and they could not give a single F. And so Danny heads to see the projectionist, which is Nick, which ultimately he is best friends with. Ultimately, we find out that Nick had been sleeping behind the wheel, and so ultimately Danny's like, well, hey, you know what? Like, I've seen this movie like 6 times already, so when looking at it, it's no skin off this guy's back. So they fixed the blurry movie, and it's to the credits, and we didn't really actually see much of a resolve from that. But anyways, so we get it to where Nick is telling Danny that there is going to be a midnight showing of Jack Slater 4. So we realize that this person has done numerous movies now, and we have to consistently have Danny mention some portion of movie that happened somewhere to ultimately have us really give Jack Slater a backstory, but then also to give Danny this like movie knowledge, which of course he has. So we have it to where ultimately Danny is to forcibly needing to go to school because reasonably he is like numerous hours late. And so even when he does go to actual school, he ends up going and like imagining that a film that he had ultimately seen at school, like he changes all the actors around to make it look like Arnold is in the movie and kind of playing out the whole scenes. So, and then eventually we have it to where Danny ends up like skipping school, and because ultimately he just doesn't care about school, he just wants to see movies all day. So, and we have it to where his mother finds out that he had skipped school, and ultimately uh, she ultimately just says that he was sick. To where ultimately it was a justifiable reason for this kid to be not there. So Danny ends up going and is really wanting to go and see Jack Slater 4. And so ultimately he goes and sneaks out of his house to ultimately have some burglar of sorts that ultimately pushes him into his home and tries to steal some of his stuff, cuffing him into his bathroom. And ultimately we have the burglar that comes in there and he's like, dude, there's not even worth anything to really steal. I'm not going to get any high value out of any of your stuff. So we have it to where the culprit who had cuffed Danny to this bathroom tossed the handcuffed key into the toilet. So we have it to where Danny fills out a police report, and ultimately we have the police officer that is mentioning to this kid, it's like, hey, like, your mother, we called your mother, and your mother is telling you to come right home. So we have Danny who is not going to come right home. He is going to just go off into seeing Jack Slater 4. So we have it to where ultimately Nick is ultimately giving Danny at this midnight showing a very special ticket, which has a unique story, and ultimately we have it to where this ticket is supposedly magical. And so reasonably we have it to where Danny goes and gets this ticket and then ultimately goes and sees Jack Slater 4. And we have it to where Nick is mentioned to Danny. It's like, hey, do you think Jack Slater is gonna bite it this time? And Danny's like, no way. So we end up having the credits roll and the movie roll. We end up finding out that Benedict, who is the villain of this movie with the glass eye, is ultimately teaming up with a man called Vivaldi. Vivaldi, I believe his name is. And we have it to where ultimately we have Vivaldi who has all these like crappy sayings that makes absolutely no sense. We find out that seemingly that Benedict and Vivaldi are torturing Jack's cousin Frank for information, and we have it to where Frank is giving him nothing because it's like, dude, all we talk about together is guns. Like what? Like I'm not gonna be able to tell you jack squat nothing. So we end up having it to where ultimately Jack is on his way to seemingly visit his cousin, and we find out that there are two police officers that are ultimately at this home. And so we have it to where Jack is ultimately just kind of calling them off to ultimately have it to where he is going to blah, 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 he's going into the house upon himself, and we have it to where Jack is talking to Frank, and he's telling him a little bit of information that ultimately the gangs are kind of working together. And ultimately, right after that, the Frank ends up just kind of like, okay, I'm done now, and he dies. We have it to where, luckily enough, that Jack Slater had taken off of this little note that ultimately was left for Jack, and it was just a countdown of numbers to where ultimately Jack rushes out of the building and say, "It's going to explode!" And so ultimately we have it to where both cops are both dead, but Jack's fine. We have it seemingly where both cops or we have one cop that is ultimately like, I was 2 days from retirement, and ultimately he keels over. So we have it to where Jack ends up going and seemingly being eventually like chased away. To ultimately there are guys that ultimately have to die in absurd ways, like getting a cone in the head, an ice cream cone in the head at some point. Um, but eventually we have it to where seemingly like these guys are dying, and so we eventually have it to where there is a truck that is chasing after Jack, rippling all this music, and we have it to where reasonably there is a thing of dynamite that is also very cartoonish looking, that is being tossed out of frame to get tossed into the movie theater with Danny. To ultimately Danny is seeing the dynamite that is being lit to where ultimately he is running to the opposite end of where the dynamite is, which is ultimately running closer to the screen. We ultimately have Danny who is sitting next to Jack Slater. Ultimately, we have Jack Slater who is seemingly not really like he's driving his car, but he has his gun the entire time behind him, just kind of shooting at whoever he can. So we have it to where eventually Jack ends up outsmarting these goons and taking them all out. And so we have it to where eventually we have it to where Jack is now trying to figure out, okay, what is up with this kid? Why is it that he's in my back seat? This makes no sense. So we have it to where ultimately we have Jack going into his office to ultimately be ridiculed by his boss. Ultimately, his boss is a guy that is a consistent screamer of sorts, but a lot of it is pure absurdity, which makes no sense. Slater! It's like, what is any of this stuff that he's saying? So we end up having Danny, while he is kind of seeing this police department, he's starting to poke holes in the belief that Jack is ultimately not a real person. Like we have it to where Jack is getting a phone call from his wife, and we have it to where Jack is to ultimately just have a recording of sounds of which that he has said in past, and ultimately I guess like that could easily play to not actually having to have a phone call with this woman. So we ultimately have Jack who is going to go to his superior, but we have it where Danny is just kind of mentioning it's like, okay, why do we have an animated cat in this movie? And ultimately, Jack Slater says, oh well, that's Whiskers. If anything, he was on leave, but he has come back. And it's like, doesn't that look goofy to you, Jack Slater? And he's like, no, like if anything, he's a good partner and whatever. So we have it to where reasonably Danny is starting to poke holes, but eventually we're going to poke even more holes. So we end up having it to where Danny is going and hearing, uh, uh, hearing blah, blah, Decker ultimately give Jack Slater crap and is like yelling and shouting or whatever to the point of like his door busting, because that's the thing that he always does. So we have it to where it's seemingly that like smoke is coming from out of his ears for how much he's yelling and so on and so forth. So we eventually have it to where Danny ends up stopping Decker to ultimately mention it's like, hey, like remember in the past where ultimately you two were ultimately having a little sweet nothing of conversation where we had like Decker respecting Jack. Whatever happened to that? And we have it to where Decker's like, oh my god, I thought you didn't tell anybody. And we have it to where Slater is ultimately saying like, yeah, I didn't tell anyone. Like I didn't tell anybody that secret stuff that we had both said at some point. So we have it to where Decker is really investigating this kid and putting him under a microscope and interrogating him. Basically, we have it to where Decker is kind of interrogating Danny because he's not a real boy, and so there's seemingly no information on this kid, and so. But reasonably, we have it to where Danny knows every single thing about these people, and so reasonably, we have it to where Danny is like just making it so that they know so like that they think that maybe he's some kind of psychic or that he just is like all knowing. And so we eventually have it to where Danny is telling Jack that's like, hey, like I can tell you exactly where the people are that had killed your cousin. And so we immediately have Decker that's like, well, like it seems like this kid knows a lot. So if anything, I'm gonna make you his partner. And we have Danny and Jack Slater just walking out, and Danny again is poking holes at all this. I'm like, dude, there is no way that me as a kid is gonna easily and quickly just all of a sudden become your partner. Like it never worked. Like there's no way that it works that way, and so on and so forth. We ultimately have it to where Danny is going and showcasing exactly where the villains are, and we have it to where Jack Slater is like, wow, like out of the numerous years of police work and all the things that I've ever done, like all I would have ever have had to do is just have the skill enough to just go into anyone's home and to point out to them and say, yeah, the bad guys are in there. And so we end up having Danny point out the exact place where ultimately this villain lives. And we have it to where Danny is mentioning that this guy has a glass eye. And so we ultimately have it to where Jack Slater is opening the door to see ultimately this glass eyed individual. And that ultimately this guy is just rude as F. To where Jack Slater is like, you know what? Like, there's no way in hell that I'd wanna be spending any more seconds with you compared to me wanting to clean out my sock drawer. But ultimately, can you just make this easy on us to where we'd have to uh, just kind of like get this done and get out of your hair? And ultimately, we have it to where Benedict is ultimately just going like, well, no, like if anything, I have attacked dogs that are ultimately gonna like at a snap ultimately attack you, and we have Jack Slater is like, well, that's great and all, but how are you gonna be able to do any little bit of snapping your fingers when ultimately I'm just gonna snap your thumbs? So we end up having it to where ultimately Benedict shows that he has a glass eye, and Jack Slater is okay with all this. So we have it to where they can't investigate any further, and so we end up having Benedict kind of closing the door, and we have it to where Danny is mentioning like that he had saw him hurt his cousin, and so reasonably every little bit of thing that Danny had heard through the movie. He had been repeating of what Vivaldi said and everything like that, like Sicilian schmuck and all this stuff. So and ultimately we had Benedict overhear this because he had a door that was open just a crack. And so eventually we have it to where Benedict is going and wanting to investigate who this kid is. So we eventually still want Danny to prove to Jack Slater that he is an imaginary person. And so they go all the way to Blockbuster to ultimately prove certain things. That one, everybody in a movie or a show or whatever has the number 555 in their phone number. And why is it that there are so many people that have the number 555 all in their numbers? It makes no sense. And then ultimately we have it to where um, we have Jack who's ultimately mentioning like, well, we have area codes for this, and 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 so recently we have it to where Danny is just like, oh my god. But ultimately, he goes to Blockbuster to see that there is a seemingly edited uh, movie poster of, instead of it being Arnold as the Terminator, we have towards Sylvester Stallone, which that would be honestly kind of really fun to ultimately actually just legitimately see that movie, to have Arnold like just instead of it being Arnold, to see it be like Sylvester Stallone. I think that would be actually hilarious. And I think that there are kind of videos of that going around where they're like deep fakes and stuff along those lines. But anyways, so we have it to where it seems that Jack ends up kind of conveniently uh, hitting on women or getting women to hit on him, and ultimately Jack eventually gets a phone number from some beautiful woman, and he's ultimately just like, yeah, clever way of ultimately trying to get some girl's phone number. Like, thanks a lot. So we end up having it to where ultimately Jack is still not convinced, and we have to have Danny still kind of bring up a lot more things that ultimately are going to poke holes through this movie. So we eventually have it to where Jack is off uh, to go off and talk to somebody, but eventually he will come back home. Because ultimately we're having Danny, who is left with Whitney, who is the daughter of um, Jack. So we ultimately find that we have Danny uh, meeting Whitney, and Whitney ends up locking lips with him right away. And ultimately, we find out Whitney is to be a part of some school project where she has to kiss the first guy or first kid that comes to the door. There's some freshman thing that they have to do. So we end up having it to where Whitney is ultimately talking about like kind of get together and have good old times with Arnold and her. They're hugging it out and ipso facto. So we have it to where eventually Jack is ultimately going and telling Danny about phony money, and ultimately, like, it gets to the point where Jack is off to go investigate something, um, but eventually he is to come back. So we ultimately have it uh, to where Danny is ultimately being held hostage. Benedict ends up crashing in to nab Whitney, and then ultimately to intimidate Danny. And Danny, when Whitney ends up getting grabbed, we have it to where Danny's mentioning like, if you hurt one hair on her head, and we have it to where, funny enough, Benedict does the one thing that he says, and like, what are you gonna do? He plucks the thing off her hair and he tears it apart. He's like, what are you gonna do? Like, what are you gonna do? So we have it to where Benedict is talking to Danny, and ultimately he is mentioning like, okay, how is it that you heard and saw and everything? I didn't see you where I was, so how do you know everything? And we have it to where Danny is mentioning like, oh, there was cameras in the statues, there was cameras here, there was a microphone here. I heard everything. I heard it all. And we have it to where Benedict is really not convinced. But eventually, Danny is offering up the dirty money, and of course, Benedict eventually sniffs that out that it's dirty money. So we have them burn the dirty money. We find out that when Jack comes back, he is seeing the red smoke signal of there being money burnt, and so ultimately he's like, "Oh, something's amiss. Something's in trouble. Something's going down." And so ultimately, we have it to where there's a knock at the door, and we're thinking it's Jack Slater, but it's not. It's a kid who is ultimately going to get some smooches. Yeah. We ultimately have Jack who ends up going and crashing through a roof window, I guess, of sorts, and takes down two men simultaneously. We also have Whitney, who was, before Jack was to arrive, she had taken one guy out, screaming and yelling at a very much annoying frequency, but it's like, it is what it is. Um, we have it to where she takes somebody down and then ultimately pulls a gun on Benedict, and then eventually Whitney is still outnumbered, but really that's when Jack comes crashing in and ultimately tries to even the odds. So we eventually have it to where reasonably Benedict is trying to get away, and we have it to where Danny is trying to play chicken with Benedict's car because he thinks that he's like the hero of this and he'll be fine, but then he also realizes that he's the sidekick and he's only there for comic relief and he'll probably die. So then he goes and crashes into he does the ET over the moon thing, and then he kind of crashes through a couple homes. So we end up having Jack who grabs Danny and is ultimately kind of just hollowing or having come into just ultimately just uh, get to wherever they need to go. Anyways, so pushing on. So we ultimately have it to where reasonably we ultimately know who the villain of this story is. So it seems that eventually we have within here that uh, that they find out that there is some information, um, because we ultimately have it to where or he wait blah, 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 blah. Let's rewind a little bit. So Jack ends up taking Danny back to the home, and they're kind of doing some aftermath briefing and stuff like that. We end up finding out that there is a an eyeball that ultimately says vengeance is and then mine, and then we have it to where Arnold's like, oh my god, it's a bomb, and then the house just explodes because everything has to explode in this movie. So we have it to where reasonably uh, Jack and Danny are getting ridiculed by their boss. To where again, it's like and we have it to where Jack turns to Danny. He's like, "Is that even in English?" And he's like, "I don't get it." So we end up having it to where they like he's yelling at him, and again, it costs him his badge for the 1800th time, and so we have it uh, to where Jack is packing his bags, and we ultimately have a guy that shouts out like how do you get to Carnegie Hall, and ultimately we have it to where Arnold is saying in reply practice. Because ultimately we have it to where this guy ultimately is called Practice. His name is John Practice. So we find Practice is kind of giving, is ultimately saying that he is working on some Fed case, and ultimately there seems to be some interesting developments within that case. It seems that he is mentioning it's like, hey, how about you and me go and work this Lou Fatso or Lou Farts job, and we have it to where at first Jack Slater is like, yeah, no, I'm just gonna kind of take my ball and go home. So we ultimately have Jack who goes into his actual apartment, and we have it to where Jack goes into his apartment and shoots his closet. To where Danny's like, "Oh my God, how did you know that there was a guy in there?" And he's like, "There's always a guy in there." So ultimately, he mentions that he has to pay like a fortune for closet doors, and so we end up having Jack who is mentioning that uh, every single one of these like the longer that he's doing police work for, that everything is getting so much harder. And we have it to where Danny is saying it's like, well, yeah, like there's sequels, they have to get harder. And we have it to where Jack is like, and ultimately I just don't quite understand how every single time I ended up like surviving through all this. Eventually I'm gonna have to kick the bucket at some point. And like Danny is like, no, like if anything, they're gonna keep you going because if anything, these movies are making a lot of money, so they're gonna keep you alive because these movies are doing well. So we ultimately have it to where Jack is just really just in a downward spiral. He's in a very low place, but we ultimately have it to where eventually he is rationally realizing that they need to get on the road again and maybe be a part of that Leo the Fart case. So we ultimately uh, like there might be something out of this. So they end up kind of thinking about it, and they're ultimately going and assessing that Leo the Fart. Like there's got to be something going on with this funeral. There's too many people there uh, that have like a reason to die. So we end up having it to where Jack is ultimately coming to the consensus that supposedly Leo Lafart could probably have a bomb inside of him to kill all these people off at this funeral all in one shot. And we have to where Danny has to mention to Jack that it's like, dude, we've already had too many explosions in this movie. And so we find out that Jack realizes that there was a bunch of Nerf gas stolen. So reasonably, we have it to where Leo the Fought is going to fought one last time, or he's going to pass gas one last time. So we end up having it to where they are making it to this place where this funeral is at, and we have it to where uh, Arnold is trying to wave down Practice to just be like, hey man, like I need like, because ultimately we have it to where Jack is shouting out Practice, and we have it to where John is like makes perfect. It's like we have to where bizarrely like Practice has so many of these effing catchphrases and whatever, and we ultimately have it uh, to where Danny is like, you know what, I don't trust Practice. Like I think I've seen him in another movie where he's been a villain before, so I think he's going to be a villain in this movie because he in another movie he ended up killing Mozart, and so we have it to where Danny is or Jack is ultimately going with Practice to go to some secret wing or something like that. But that eventually turns to be Bupkis Nowhere, and so Jack is kind of sniffing it out that Practice is lying. So Practice ends up pulling a gun on Jack, and ultimately Jack is saying, "Yeah, I knew it was you because Danny told me you killed Mozart." And Practice is like, "Who? Zot." And Practice is like, "I kill a lot of people. I don't even know what their names are anymore. Maybe I did kill a Mozart." But we have it to where ultimately, like, we have it to where we have the classic trope where a villain doesn't want to kill the hero yet, so they have to take an utterly exceedingly amount of time to just uh, ultimately just kind of mention what all they're going to do, their master plan, what all is going down. And so we have it to where reasonably Danny is to pull a gun on Practice, to where Practice ends up getting cuffed. And so reasonably we end up having Danny, who is ultimately saying that's like, yeah, you did the classic stupid villain mistake. You talked, shut up and kill somebody. And we have it to where Vivaldi ends up going and going like, well, you made a mistake too. So we have it to where both Jack and we have it to where both Jack and Danny are to be cuffed. And so reasonably we have it to where now they are mentioning how long they have it to where uh, like the bomb is going to explode, the Nerf bomb. And so we have it to where Practice is going to kill both Jack and Danny. But we have it to where ultimately Whiskers ends up coming and saving the day and shooting Practice. So we ultimately have it to where Jack is ultimately thankful for Whiskers, and ultimately Whiskers is mentioning like, "Oh, hey, well, you saved my tail plenty of times." So we have it where Jack has to scramble and tell Danny to forcibly have this one crane on the top of the building in X amount of minutes. So Jack makes his way all the way up to the very top of the building to make it to this funeral and to make his way to Lou the fart, and so we have it to where he goes and he kind of gets really close to the body and he says, "Oh my God, he's still alive! Can't you hear him? Help me! He's still alive!" And we have it to where he's yelling and screaming, "Is there a doctor in the house? He's still alive!" And we have it to where a doctor is ultimately looking and saying, "Oh, I'm a doctor!" And we have it to where Arnold ends up cracking this guy off to the side of the head, knocking him out. To where it's like, "Oh my God, he needs a doctor!" And so we have it to where reasonably everybody is all pulling guns on Jack at this point, and Jack is just running off to this crane and is hooking Lou onto this crane, and nobody's gonna shoot Jack because he could drop Leo. So we have this scramble against time. There's just minutes to go, and so ultimately we have it to where uh, we have to where uh, there is a helicopter eventually coming to seemingly or wait blah, 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 blah. We seemingly have it to where there is a point in time where Jack is within this elevator and it is going down, and ultimately eventually we end up having it to where there's a helicopter that comes by and shoots through this elevator to where eventually Jack ends up having the elevator kind of like fall, and then ultimately he ends up like falling off this elevator. So eventually Danny is trying to get the body away, as far away from this building as he can, but then eventually Jack goes and catches the hook of this building. So we have it to where Jack ultimately is making his way to this tar pit by this dinosaur place, and so Jack is like telling him when to drop the crane and everything like that onto this tar pit. We ultimately have Jack, who is running as quickly away from this explosion as possible. We have it to where the explosion goes off, and Danny is ultimately making his way to uh, clean himself after getting hit with all this tar. Coincidentally, we have Danny, who had run so amazingly quickly to, and this is like minutes here. Like we have it where Danny is running all his way to get to Jack right as he's like hopping over the side to clean himself off. And we have it to where coincidentally we have Whitney, who comes with her monster truck, told me tell Jack um, that hey, yeah, I heard that you were over here, and I brought you some clean clothes, and we have it to where Danny is going like, isn't this a little convenient? And we have it to where Jack is ultimately mentioning it's like, well, didn't you say that this was a movie? So we have it to where eventually that we have to get it to where eventually uh, Benedict eventually gets the uh, this golden ticket. Uh, so that way we have this moment here because we have Jack Slater eventually going and uh, breaking into Benedict's home to have a shootout. And so we have it to where ultimately, because Benedict ends up shooting Vivaldi, and we have it to where Vivaldi is mentioning, like, you went and did a 360 on me. And he's like, 180. If I would have done a 360, I would have been right back to where I started. And so we have it to where Benedict just shoots Vivaldi, and then we have it to where Vivaldi's like handler is ultimately saying like, well, is there anything I need to do for you? And he's like, well, clean the pool. So we have it to where eventually Jack crashes into Benedict's home, and we have it to where eventually there is a shootout that is going on with Benedict's gigantic gun. And so basically that lands it to where Benedict eventually gets this golden ticket and makes his way out of this movie, and we have it uh, to where Danny is mentioning it's like, yeah, we need to go after him. If anything, the hole to get out of this movie is still good. So let's get out of here. So Jack and Danny make their way out of this theater, and so recently it seems that we have Benedict be doing some research while he's out of the bubble to ultimately find out that Jack Slater is actually Arnold Schwarzenegger. There's a big movie release of Jack Slater 4. And so reasonably, we have it to where Jack is consistently chasing after Benedict. We're seeing Benedict drive off in some taxi, and we have it to where Jack is ultimately shooting a gun at this taxi, and we have it to where uh, Jack is mentioning it's like, get ready for another explosion, kid. And then ultimately he fires at the taxi, and the taxi doesn't explode. And we have it to where Jack is like, man, like taxis are strong here. So we have it to where reasonably we get it to where Jack is chasing after Benedict consistently going through taxis, which ultimately he's no longer in these taxis. It seems like he's going from ticket to ticket to like to where ultimately he's just kind of easily being able to use this power whenever he wants now. So we have it to where Danny is ultimately going and Danny's ultimately going with Jack to chase down and try to find what the heck is going on with Benedict. And we have it to where reasonably they end up finding in the taxi cab what what Benedict is going to try to do with a giant scrape out of Arnold Schwarzenegger's name to kill him. We ultimately have Benedict, who is also pulling people from movies. We have it to where Benedict had pulled Ripper from one of the Jack Slater movies to ultimately tell him, like, hey, like, if anything, like, you're going to go to the movie premiere to try to kill Arnold Schwarzenegger. So we have it to where we had Danny ultimately going home with Jack Slater, and we have it to where Jack Slater is ultimately mentioning that he's Arnold Braunschweiger, and but also there was a moment where uh, Jack, Danny, and Nick were all talking too, because Nick had overslept, and we have it where Danny is ultimately showcasing Arnold to Nick, and we have it to where Nick is mentioning, "Oh, I love your films too, sir," and we have it to where Danny is going like, "No, like if anything, like this is Jack Slater, this is Jack," and he's like, "Oh my god." And he's like, "Oh my god, the ticket worked!" And he's like, "Oh man, I could have so much time to ultimately just go and see all these things that I could ever see before. Like there was some girls, some movie stars that I had such a crush on." And so we have it to where Danny is mentioning that Benedict has the ticket, and they have to figure out what's going on. So and kind of Jack is ultimately realizing that he's a real fictional character and how he feels so horrified by this because it's like, dude, I have nightmares every single night of my kid dying in my arms. It's like, yeah, I guess that doesn't matter to whoever wrote this thing, but like it matters to me. So and all this and that ultimately that this character isn't real, it's all fiction and it's all fake. So but we have it to where eventually Jack is to meet Danny's mom, and we have Jack mentioning that he's a police officer, that he had Danny go and see if he could point out the thief that ultimately taken had tried to rob Danny's home earlier. So we end up having Jack who is talking to Danny's mother, and we have it to where Danny is ultimately ridiculing, or we have it to where Jack ridiculing Danny for like, oh my god, why do you watch movies late at night and like making your mother poor and poor with worry or whatever, and Danny's like, oh my god, you turned him into you or whatever, you turned him into an adult or you turned him into whatever, and we have to where his mother's like, yeah, surefire enough. So we end up having Jack Slater, who is kind of like mentioning that he had talked to Danny's mother, and like we never just like I never just talked to a woman before. Like it was kind of funny how like thinking about this scene now, how when Danny was in the movie, how basically he has to poke fun of the fact that there are like gorgeous supermodels all over this movie, and there is no way that half of these women would be actually wearing half of these wardrobes in a normal setting, and this and that. Like it looks so absurd and this and that. So, anyways, we have it to where going like there's like detectives that are wearing next to nothing in their wardrobes, and it makes no rational sense. So going into here, we have eventually to the point of going to finding out uh, that Benedict is going for Arnold. So we have to where Arnold is making his way to, or Jack Slater is making his way to Arnold Schwarzenegger's movie premiere, and so we push on to ultimately see all these celebrities that are making their way to this premiere, and eventually Ripper is making his way to this premiere uh, to kill someone. So we have it to where ultimately Jack is going to the lower balcony to find where Arnold is sitting, and we have it to where the Ripper is on the upper balcony, going and flinging the knife down to Arnold. We ultimately have it to where Jack is saving Arnold, and we have it to where Arnold is mentioning like, "Wow, like you and me look really a lot alike." Like if anything, I didn't realize they were doing any kind of stunts. Um, with his promotion. Like, man, like, but ultimately we have it to where Jack is mentioning, or Arnold is mentioning how many like things that he could probably have him do in the future, and Jack mentions how much pain that he had brought uh, Jack Slater's character and that he hates him. So we end up having it to where uh, Danny goes to the upper balcony to be taken by um, the Ripper. So we have this whole scene replaying out all over again, to where the Ripper is holding Danny hostage, and Jack is ultimately kind of playing the same notes all over again, to where eventually the Ripper just gets really bored, and he's like, you know what, I'm getting kind of bored. How about we just skip to the end? So we have it to where Danny is tossed over the side, and we have it to where Jack is ultimately going to take the axe that Ripper had thrown, and he is going to, instead of tossing it at the Ripper, he is going to, because we have Ripper was like, come on, Jack, come on, Jack, come on, like, yeah, Jack, come on, like, it's so absurd, but we end up having Jack, who ends up taking, because it's heavily raining on this rooftop, and we have it to where Jack ends up taking the axe to an electrical fixture, which electrocutes the entire ground around him, to where we have the Ripper saying, I'll be back. And we have it to where Jack is like, the hell you will. So we end up finding out that Danny is still alive, and he's dangling on some little statue of sorts. And we have it to where Jack is ultimately going and sliding down some rope to ultimately have Danny hang on, and then go and like have Danny shove out his hands for Jack to catch him, because I'll catch you. So we end up having Danny, who ends up grabbing onto Jack's arms, and Jack ends up slinging uh, Danny back to the top of the roof, and then Danny climbs with the rope back to the top of the roof, and we have it to where Jack is mentioning like, yeah, I think I need to go to the hospital. I think my shoulder's out of socket. And so we have it to where ultimately Benedict is shouting, and ultimately just like, yeah, I'm here kind of thing. And so we have it to where Danny and Jack ends up kind of running off to avoid gunfire. And Benedict is mentioning like, oh man, there's unlimited possibilities. Like, do you guys want Dracula? Like, I can get King Kong. I can get anybody. I can get Rosemary's Baby, and this and that. And we have it to where ultimately it seems that Benedict had run out of bullets, and we have it to where Jack is ultimately mentioning, it's like, well, oh, look at that, no bullets. It's like, you made the classic villain mistake. You forgot to reload the dang gun. And we have it to where Benedict is like, no, I just left one chamber empty. And then he ends up firing upon Jack and ends up getting him in the gut. So we end up having it to where ultimately uh, Jack eventually gets to Benedict, and ends up going and killing him. And so we end up killing Benedict, but the only real problem is that Benedict ends up losing the ticket. And ends up landing in some theater where Ian McKellen, who is ultimately playing Death, is ultimately coming out of the theater. And we have it to ultimately the ambulance is ultimately trying to revive Jack Slater's character, but they're all just kind of going like he's not going to make it kind of thing. We have it to where Danny is like, take him back to where ultimately this is a flesh wound. And so we ultimately have it to where Jack is being Danny is kind of pulling a gun on everybody, and so we have it to where he is driving away on the ambulance to make his way to the movie theater. So we end up having Ian McKellen, who is Death, make his way to this movie theater, and we have it to where uh, Danny is ultimately pointing a gun at Ian McKellen's character, saying like, "No, you're not going to take him." And he's like, "He's not even on my list." And ultimately, we have it to where Death is mentioning that he was just curious, and ultimately, one thing about this kid is that he's not very bright, and that ultimately he'd be looking for the other half of that ticket. So we have it to where Danny ultimately drop kicks this ticket thing, and ultimately he's like, "Oh my God, they're all gold!" But eventually he finds the ticket, and so eventually we have it to where Arnold touches the ticket, to where ultimately it puts life back into this theater to ultimately get Jack back in the movie. So they end up uh, shoving him back into the movie, and ultimately Danny's like, "Hey, any help?" To ultimately Whiskers is mentioning, "Oh my God, Jack's been shot. Move, get somebody over here." So you ultimately have it to where Jack and Danny have this moment to ultimately uh, Jack is saying, "Hey, Danny, like I think it's time that we need to say goodbye, like because reasonably, uh, like we don't know if the ticket still has juice, and I don't want you to get stuck here." So we have it to where Danny is just having an emotional moment with Jack, just only going like, "Well, but I don't want to leave. Like I would blah blah blah." So we have it to where Jack is ultimately mentioning that, like, "Dude, I'll always be here for you in a film." And so reasonably we have Jack who is going through here and telling Danny that it's like, and take care of your mother because I would love to do so many kinds of things to your mother, but he can't say that because it's a PG-13 movie. I thought it was funny when ultimately Danny gives Jack Slater a word that he has to say. It's like, "Hey, just say this word," and we have it to where Jack is like, "I'm not going to say the word." And it's like, yeah, of course you're not going to say that word because this is a PG-13 movie. You can't cuss, you can't swear. So we end up having it to where Danny or Jack is ultimately getting seemingly looked after by these doctors, and ultimately the doctor says this isn't even a flesh wound, and so he ends up getting carted away, and Danny leaves, and ultimately we have it to where Jack uh, is making his way to his boss's office while the boss is ultimately yelling Slater, and ultimately we have it to where Jack ends up crashing through uh, this guy's door with his fist. And he's like, "It's working again," because ultimately when he crashed his through some glass before, he ended up hurting his hand, and so he's like, "Man, this reality, all kinds of garbage." So we have it to where Jack is finally just going like, "Stop shouting!" it's like dude, you're just doing all this script. You're just doing all this stuff from off of a script. If anything, like Hollywood is writing out our lives and all this and that. And I just found it like, and we have this like whole thing going on, and we have it to where Nick and Danny are just kind of riding off into the sunset. Um, ultimately, just kind of just walking away, just ultimately going like, yeah, it's great that he ended up like living at the very end of this. So they ride off in the sunset, and that's what just kind of ends the movie, where ultimately we just have Jack Slater who is just kind of driving off, and then he's waving, and that's to end the whole movie. So I'm going to get out of here. Goodbye, everybody. Goodbye, everybody.